right, David, we're good to go whenever you want to fire it up. Get the show on the road.
Okay. I'm going to call the committee meeting of Government Operations and Ordinance to order. I don't think I have to do a roll call. I'll just indicate that all three members of the committee are here. I'm going to start with, like we did last time with Dean, with a shortened version of where we're at and just a recap of what's going on. Mr. Trefethen.
Thank you, Councilor. To members of the audience, I do have a few copies of the presentation if anybody needs it for reference. Just real brief, because we have not had much of a chance to update anything. There really haven't been any major updates. The papers that I handed out tonight, the changes that have been made are in red, so that you'll know what we have updated. So real brief. So we need to add a definition for short-term lodging. We have clarified the number of days. State law 78A3(7) is 184 days is the magic number for short-term rentals for dwelling units. So that's the only change in that section. Basically, any dwelling unit that is not a hotel or a motel or a bed and breakfast that's being done on a short-term rental would be covered under this definition.
Are we bound to use the 184 days?
Well, no. I mean, we could limit it further on when we get into the regulation section of this. We could limit it to whatever is decided. But you know, there had been some discussion about what was the right number for the state definition of short-term rental, and the number is 184. This is the actual zoning section that would be the regulations for short-term rentals, and we have the in the second paragraph, whatever it is there, the word impacted is the change that we've done, and that the rest of this is the same. And real briefly, we're going to create a short-term lodging application, determine whether the application should go forward or not. It would be a one-year term. The part of the application process is a defined inspection, and then part number 5 is the section on what are the fines and penalties for not having the administrative approval to do a short-term rental. And then the next page there is the would be the department things, behind-the-scenes items that would occur. The planning department would, as I mentioned, would create a application form. We'll define a process for the applications to go through. We'll define what the inspections are going to be. We will define what the complaint process will be. And when someone applies for short-term rental, we will send out notification to abutters and also provide the complaint criteria to the abutters as well, so they'll know what the avenue is. It is hoped that by being a little proactive with the abutters and letting them know how they can be part of the process will help as well. The inspection criteria, in a nutshell: smoke and CO detectors, windows in the bedroom must function. Windows in other rooms that are 7 feet or more above the ground must also be functionable. A visible fire extinguisher in the kitchen, and no use of the basement unless there are proper egress windows and or door. We're going to have policies about trash, parking, occupancy. Occupancy is going to be based on the fire code, National Fire Code, which is 200 square foot per person. So a 1,400 square foot, 3-bedroom house would be a maximum of 7 people, just as an example. We'll have contact information and share this contact information with the various departments of the city, particularly police, so that they'll know which units are subject to short-term rentals, and if they have any calls, to let us know. And then the third page, which I provided you tonight, is the New Hampshire RSA references. 78A 4A, it talks about the advertisements for short-term rentals. And I underlined the last sentence in this RSA because I thought it was very pertinent to what we're trying to do here, and that is, nothing in this section shall be construed to change or alter the nature of the use of a property for the purpose of determining compliance with local zoning ordinances. And then 78A3 is a definition of a hotel. And a hotel includes lodging homes, rooming houses, furnished room houses, boarding houses, cottages, camps, chalets, and apartments. All subject to the rooms and meals tax if they're renting on a short-term basis, i.e. 184 days or less. So that's it in a nutshell. Entertain any questions. I did receive the article that had been forwarded to me today. I'm not sure I had seen that particular article, but I have seen several other articles. I do know that the company that produced that article is a company that's looking for business from cities and towns to help us enforce the ordinance, and so they're looking for
You're soliciting.
they're soliciting, but that's okay. There's some very useful information in there, and we'll take a close look at that and see if there's we can glean anything else out of it. With that,
Well, I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the committee or members of the public, to the committee or the members of the public. And I don't mean this to be a laundry list, but as far as the 180 days, the 184 days is concerned, I'd like us to consider a waiver of that if the person who is hosting is a permanent resident of the city and they are also living in the home, some kind of a waiver for that proposal. I'd like us to think about requiring a contact person for whoever is hosting this, so that we'll have someone to contact and an immediate response within a reasonable amount of time with respect to that. I'm wondering about how we go about, number one, charging a fee for the application, and I think we should charge a fee for the application. I just don't know what it is. And number two, in terms of penalties, I'd like consideration for a warning in the first instance, and if there's repeat behavior, then penalties and possible revocation of license. Those are the areas that I'm concerned with. Does anybody else on the committee want to make some comments before I open it up to the public?
Thanks, Chairman. I share your concerns on perhaps a waiver for 184 consecutive nights. Also, a local contact person is I think, very wise to have. Some suggestions that I've had. One is that the term direct abutter is problematic for some people in some communities. For instance, Paugus Bay Park area. You may not be, if you've got a house that's being rented out through Airbnb, you only have 2 abutters on each side of that house. But really, if it turns into a party house or somewhere that's affecting the whole nature and character of a neighborhood, it's not just direct abutters. It's people within a reasonable proximity of that house on that street that this could be impacting. So I think it's important to take that into consideration as well. So I would expand that. but I think there's got to be a reasonableness standard. Are you a couple houses away, or are you a couple streets away? Obviously, there's a difference there, and I think that whoever's looking at this ought to be able to say there is a fair and reasonable circumference around that house that people would have an opportunity to speak up as to the impact of that short-term rental or short-term lease. I also think this, there's got to be a way to put this all online to make it a lot easier for people to track which homes are part of the database of Airbnb or VRBO, so we know where the residences are. Also should be a place that someone can register a complaint to the city about whether it's trash or whether it's, I realize noise has to go to the police, perhaps it goes to issues of parking, but we ought to simplify this and also hopefully cut down on paperwork and maybe the amount of labor that goes into it as well, and tracking who's got a short-term rental, what are the violations being alleged, perhaps who's alleging them, and what an abutter or someone who's impacted by this can expect for a response from the city as well. So it doesn't just go into the information black hole on a website, that they know what the plan is, they know what the protocol is going to be. I had one other thing here too. And really, I think it really comes down to, enforceability. It's great that we put these regulations in place so we can preserve the quality of and character of neighborhoods and help people preserve the value of their property. But we also have to have not so much a severity of punishment if someone gets complaints and they are complaints with evidence backing them up, but it's the certainty of actions being taken on behalf of the city to address those situations, not necessarily the severity of any punishment or punitive nature that we're going to put into this. So how are we going to do that, I think needs to be explored so it can be done and people can know that they can depend on it and they can anticipate what's going to occur if a complaint is lodged. It's also good for people who want to have this this business as well for short-term rentals. And as I think we said at the last meeting, Mr. Chair, I think we have to look at our overlying objectives, and I take it from the document I shared with you today, having done a little research on this. What is it we want to do? We want people who want to use their property in a responsible way to have some short-term rentals, to bring in a little additional money. I personally don't have a problem with that, and I think that's entirely perhaps their right to do or their privilege to do. On the other hand, I don't want this to undercut our seasonal rental market that's out there. I certainly don't want it to have a negative impact on neighborhoods where people are buying property with the anticipation and the rightful anticipation that it's a quiet neighborhood on a residential street. Now all of a sudden it's turned into a short-term lodging that has people moving in every weekend and not really taking care or being responsible to preserve the nature of that neighborhood. So I think we should look at really what are our overarching principles here and really what are we looking to accomplish. Want to allow people to cultivate a small business, but also want to preserve the nature of the towns and the housing supply, of the neighborhoods and the housing supply. So those are the only things that I'd like to share. And a lot of this is feedback I've received from a number of constituents. I won't bother to read their letters into the record here, but certainly I think we've all received them as well from a number of people. And if not, I'm happy to share the emails and letters I've received.
Why don't we just make those part of the record?
Will. Great.
Councilor Cheney?
I had a couple of observations. One, in some paperwork that Councilman Hosmer supplied us earlier, I saw that Airbnb does not allow certain information to be included that you're suggesting must be included. So we probably ought to figure out how to.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to their website, if you want to list a property or if you want to look for a property, some of that information is not going to be there. But we'll have it. I mean, we'll have it as part of our application we'll have it as part of our database. And I like the suggestion of, we certainly can create a database that has the addresses and things of that nature and put that online. I mean, that's outside of Airbnbs or VRBOs or anybody else's control. So yeah, we could do that.
One of the suggestions I saw was that, I think the suggestion was, with the application, someone applying to rent an Airbnb or whatever it is, that you provide them with the regulations and rules in terms of their conduct. The other thing that would occur to me is perhaps we should require they be posted within the portion of the house that's rented out. Because one of the first excuses in my limited experience is I didn't know. And I'd like to prevent that.
Yep,
Limited.
we could do that.
That's it for me, for the moment anyways.
Okay.
So if I could get clarification on what you were talking about in terms of number of days. I mean, the 184 is the state definition of, if you're 184 or less for one single rental, then you've got to collect the rooms and meals tax. Now, we don't collect it, and we're not proposing under any of this that we're going to be responsible for collecting it or anything like that. But we don't have to follow that number from a standpoint of a regulation. I mean, we could allow it to be 365 days a year if that's what we chose to do. It's just that the individual rental will be less than 184 days. It might be 3 days, in which case they got to collect the tax. But whether they do that 100 times a year or whether they do it 50 times a year is...
I think the concern, or at least my concern, is that people who don't live here will be buying real estate for the sole purpose of opening up an Airbnb or VBRO, and that's what they're going to do year-round with the property. And that's why we're trying to figure out how we can limit that so that it won't be profitable for somebody to do that. But if you're a homeowner and you're a resident of the city of Laconia, and you've got an upstairs apartment that you want to rent out, that you want to use in this Airbnb or short-term rental scheme, we're not facing that same kind of issue that we would face in the other sense. We would face the issue of, this is a long-term resident, he lives there, she lives there, we might as well just let them do it as many days as possible to help them with their income. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of some kind of waiver or an exception. I don't know what the exact terms would be, but you would have to be a resident of the city of Laconia, you'd have to be living at the home that's being designated as a short-term rental on a full-time basis, something like that. And
Yeah,
in that situation, you avoid that dilemma where out-of-state or out-of-town investors are coming in for the sole purpose of turning a dime.
Yeah, so an owner-occupied situation, we might have a different set of rules or a different...
Yeah,
Okay, we'll look into that.
okay.
I am meeting with legal tomorrow to go over this and a number of other zoning issues that we have pending. So we'll see what the lawyers have to say, but...
Aren't we having fun now?
Isn't there or should we at least give some consideration to it must be resident-owned in order to qualify?
I don't have a problem with yes, we should give it some consideration. I don't know what the end product is going to be. I don't know how it's going to look. I know what it is that I want to avoid in terms of short-term rentals in the city of Laconia. The kind of nightmare situations that you got down in Florida, that you got in New Orleans, that you've got all over the country that are occurring on a regular basis, that we had
On Old North Main.
on Old North Main.
Right. Well, I guess my point is, if the person is required to be a resident of the city of Laconia, that certainly eliminates the come into town, buy a property, use it for,
I'm suggesting that's one of the criteria we use, but again,
Okay.
we're,
All right.
we're just starting off on this thing. I don't expect we're gonna develop anything.
I would hope you'd visit some language
Yeah,
about
we'll
residency.
look at that.
Ownership requirement.
I mean, we've got a couple of, ongoing situations that have existed in the city for many, many years, and, people who own, a couple of cottages along the lakefront, and they basically spend the summer in one, and maybe the next door one they rent out, periodically during the summer, and sometimes maybe other family members are in it. So we've had that situation going on for a long, long time. And I don't think that we want to disrupt that situation. We just want to have a little bit of control, perhaps. I mean, and the other well-known location, and it by no means is the only place that this is occurring, but, the South Down Long Bay area, that we have a lot of people who are not residents, but they are seasonal residents for sure. It's a second home, or they're snowbirds or whatever, and they may choose to rent out at certain times of the year. And we know that's been going on for many, many, many years, and I think the desire is for most people to let it continue, certainly in the villages that want it to continue, but
Well, that's as much a condominium thing as anything else. That's
It could be.
That's a
It
condo
could be.
association thing. They can make their own rules. If they don't comply with city rules, that's one thing. But if their rules are stricter than our rules,
oh, yeah, absolutely. If they have more restrictive rules, then the village rules would override ours. But if they have no rules, or they have very lenient rules, then we would be the controlling factor.
Okay,
But my point is, Counselor, is that we know it's, before Airbnb, before VRBO, we know this activity has been going on for decades to some degree, and I don't think we're looking to end that, but rather, recognizing that technology is perhaps going to change this situation for us, and we've got to kind of get a little bit
what
of a
we're trying
leg
to do
up
is recognize the reality
Right.
of the impact Airbnbs and VBROs are having all across the nation.
Absolutely.
That's all we're trying to do. Now, I don't want to cut anybody short, but I do want to have enough time to get some public input here and make sure that people have the opportunity to speak. So, I'm going to sort of open this up to public comment, and if you have any input, would you please come up, identify yourself, and tell us what your concerns are?
Good evening. My name is Mark Burrell. We've met before. I live at 68 Warren Street. Last week, I submitted some documentation to you. I gave it to Scott there to give to you. My concerns, first of all, is obviously this isn't going to go away. The whole Airbnb, VRBO, all of that's not going anywhere. So, in my thing, I wrote that, as I stated before, insisting that those of us who are doing the short-term rental to submit to inspections and having to pay a small fee to be permitted to operate short-term rentals out of their home, in my opinion, in the long run, will do nothing but hurt the industry in this town. As I said, City of Laconia is a tourist town, has been, more than likely always will be. I feel that if the City of Laconia wants to have short-term rentals regulated, then there should not be a fee attached to it, since nobody who is operating short-term rentals has asked for this. However, should it come to be, then I agree with the mayor that it should be a small fee, say $25 or less. The next issue that I feel is that asking my neighbors for permission to do this is going to create an issue in itself, because, for example, say Councilor Bounds and I are neighbors, and 10 years ago we had an argument, we don't get along, okay? I have to go to Councilor Bounds and say, hey, is it okay if I do this out of my house? Now, if Councilor Bounds and I are still not getting along, out of spite, he's going to say no. Then
I wouldn't do that.
I'm just using you as an example. So then the next problem would be that I'd have to go to the zoning board or the planning committee, whoever it's going to be. And then I have to go through that process, and who knows how long that's going to take. and ultimately, in the end, it will fall on them. So eliminating having to ask your neighbors just eliminates a whole host of problems. Until one of them complains, then that,
I think what we're proposing at this time, and it's nothing set in stone, but I think what we're proposing is not asking the neighbors per se, but just providing abutters or indirect abutters or radius abutters, or however we want to define it, giving them notice that you're going to do something like this. And if they have a problem with that, then they can lodge some kind of a protest that would go before the planning department first, and then to the planning board. I think that's where we're envisioning everything going, to the planning board to resolve that dispute. And if it comes down to it's a spite dispute, that ought not to prevail. That's,
and I would agree with it, but sometimes it doesn't always work out that way.
oh, I know.
So, okay, so my next one is, the mayor stated that those of us that live in the current zones that do not permit for short-term rentals be limited to 100 days a year. Now, as the gentleman before me said, the definition of short-term rentals is 184 days. What it doesn't say is it 184 days for the entire house or per rental?
Okay, that's good.
I think the 184 is state law as to when somebody renting to one person, if it's more than 184 days, they're not required at that point to collect the rooms and meals tax. I think that's where that magic number comes from. If you rented to 184 different people one day at a time, you're collecting the rooms and meals tax on those rentals every single time. So that's where the 184. If somebody signs a lease and they're going to be in your property for basically more than 6 months, that's not considered under state law a short-term rental.
Correct. So then that brings me to the next issue, and I pointed this out to you before with Councilor Hamel, that Airbnb, which is the platform I use, in New Hampshire, anybody that rents 185 days or less, Airbnb pays the rooms and meals tax. I don't have to because they charged my guest that as a service fee. So they pay for that and they submit it to the state. So anybody using Airbnb in this state does not have to pay that rooms and meals tax. Airbnb pays it out of the service fee that they charge my guest.
And well, they should.
Correct, I agree with that. As far as the 100 days per year, if I recall correctly, when I watched the last town meeting in which the mayor brought this up, he said that the people on the lake down in that area, none of them would be affected by that. Only the people in the districts that we can't do the short-term rentals would be limited to 100 days. Here's my argument against that. If you tell me I can only do it 100 days. So basically, tourist season starts in May. Memorial Day starts tourist season. So 100 days from that point on brings me to, say, 4 months down the road, 120 days. So I have to then decide whether I want the beginning of the summer, say for Bike Week, all that. Bike Week is pretty profitable for a lot of people here, all right? Then that brings me to the middle of the summer. Then I have to shut my Airbnb down. And in doing so, then I lose the leaf peepers, skiing, and anything else in between. Like at the end of the season, the end of the summer, we have Pumpkin Fest. If I'm limited to 100 days, and my 100 days runs out in, say, July, I lose that revenue as well.
Yeah, but don't you live there?
Yeah.
So you would be subject to.
I'm not speaking just for me. I'm
I
speaking for
understand,
everybody
But
now.
you would be subject to a waiver requirement if we put one in. I'm just saying that.
Correct. But
Okay.
I'm pointing that out to you for everybody that may just,
Okay.
so, let's see. All right, so if we're gonna regulate it, then so be it. I guess allow those of us that are not in that current zone, don't limit us. Just let us do it. If we have to pay a fee and then file an application, I mean, I'm not overly fond of the idea, but I don't want to stop. You know, I mean, my calendar right now, April is completely booked. May, I have one traveling nurse that has booked my room for the entire month. Okay, I just had a traveling nurse that's been with me for 3 months. She wrote me a great review. She just went back to West Virginia. So if you limit, back to limiting it to us, if I have a traveling nurse, their stays are 92 days. So if you limit me to 100 days, then one person, I'm done. Then I lose more revenue. So, understand that?
I understand.
And secondly, the thing that you gave me, I spoke to Scott about it, so I guess I'll bring that up.
It's not 100 consecutive days. That's not the point. It's 100 total days regardless of what month they're in.
Okay, see,
It's not a 100-day period. It's 100 dates that are booked,
okay, see,
regardless of what month they are.
okay, see, and when I watched it, you just said 100 days. and
Okay.
You weren't very clear about that.
All right, I'll echo the mayor's remarks because nobody could hear you. You were pointing out that it's not 100 consecutive days, it's 100 days of use of the premises over the course of a year. And the 100 days is not 100 days, it's not 180, we don't know what the number is yet. So I'll just clarify that for the record. I want you to let you know that we're going to make your correspondence that you gave to the city manager a part of the record. And it'll be part of the record for these hearings and the proposal as it goes forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Yeah, hi, Tom Siegel from Village Court. I think we have a very unique situation here, and I don't think we're going to be able to develop an easy set of rules that's going to meet all criteria. This gentleman has some pretty good points, and on the other hand, I'm worried more about single-family homes that are being, as the committee chairman said, possibly purchased and for the sole purpose of being rented out on VRBO. I have this, I submitted it by email, I'd like to submit it again just for the record, but I just had some comments on the ordinance itself, the proposed ordinance, you know, the pieces that have been proposed so far, and also just expressing my concerns about opening up single-family residential to short-term rentals.
Is that your correspondence you sent by email on April 3rd of 2019?
It should say April 2nd, sir.
Okay, I've got sent, oh, maybe it was sent to me.
There's a date on it there.
Yeah. April 2nd, 2019.
Yep, I think that's it.
Tom and Fran Siegel.
Yes, sir.
We're going to make that part of the record.
All right, well, thank you. I do share your concerns regarding properties being purchased just for the sole purpose of that. And I think we have several scenarios that need to be addressed in the ordinance. One is when someone's living in the house and they're renting out room. And the other one is single-family homes that are being rented out solely for vacations. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Siegel. Is there anybody else who would like to be heard?
My name is John Crafts, and I'm a resident at 5 High Point Road in Laconia. I've been there since 2002 as full-time residents. It's part of the Bay Reach Condominium Association. And the purpose of my comments is that there's also some further discrepancy with condominium associations as they're impacted by the short-term rental. One of the issues in an email that I sent to Scott that I pointed out is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, secondary mortgage market, have seen such a disaster with some of these short-term rentals that if too many rental units in a condominium associations are available in the course of a year or 12-month period, they will no longer finance mortgages in those communities, therefore destroying the values of them. The second point that I'd like to make is that in the condominium association, like the one we're in at Bay Reach, we were approved by the city as a very densely populated single-family residential community. A lot of the houses have less than 20 feet between their decks, between us sitting here, so that especially the one-week rentals that get highly populated when they come in, there's a huge impact, a greater impact because of the proximity to the homes. And so maybe one suggestion that I might offer, if there's an insistence to going forward with this, particularly with condominium associations, is maybe the association itself, the board of directors of the association is notified of the rentals so that they have a chance to respond, because as was mentioned earlier, in a densely populated community, there may be some residences that are 2 or 3 houses away, not necessarily different streets down the road, that are going to be hugely impacted by those rentals. And we have had problems in our community. Obviously, the advent of the internet has really exacerbated it's taken off, this whole concept's taken off. So in the past, it hasn't necessarily been problematic. It's been very limited and tend to be more long-term, but we now also have in our community a house that was bought by an outsider solely for the reason of renting this and profitability. And just as way of background, one of the reasons that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac won't finance these properties, they've learned that people that rely on these properties for income, right now we've got a great economy, but when the economy goes a little south and the rentals aren't there, all of a sudden taxes become delinquent, the condominium fees don't get paid, the maintenance of the properties don't get taken care of until the economy turns around. And in a condominium association, there's a really detrimental effect that can happen out of it when times will turn. We just know through history that's going to happen. So at least I would offer that for a condominium association that the board of directors be notified if there's going to be some rentals, so that they who represent the community can at least respond for their neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else who would like to be heard? Going once, going twice, gone. Okay. I guess at this point in time, I'm going to just ask the question of whether you think you've got a good idea now of where you might be going with this if we decide to move forward on this.
I think it's going to be very close to what we've presented to you.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of points of input here that we need to consider. And like I said, we'll be going to legal to get their 2 cents worth. There could be some either wordsmithing or some concepts that are, not agreeable to them, or in which case, we'll come back to you.
Okay, we'll share that. We will share that with all the members of the committee.
Right.
And the council, of
Right.
course.
So one other thing that I wanted to clarify on the public comments. So if you're a roommate situation, under our current zoning ordinance, you can have up to 3 roomers. So 3 people in your house that are renting a room or whatever, and you are not covered by anything. So you would not be covered by short-term rentals, you would not be covered by any of our zoning regulations. That's allowed by right now. I just want to make that clear so that people don't go away thinking, I got to kick my roommate out of my house.
No, we're not. What we're trying to do is to accommodate situations like Mr. Burrell is in, where what he's doing isn't allowed by
Right.
the zoning
No,
ordinance.
understood. Yep.
We want him to be able to do that. So, I don't.
But the clarity is, if I can interject, that what Mr. Burrell is doing right now and continue to propose to continue to do is not a roommate situation.
I got
It's
that.
a short-term rental. So even though he's only renting out 1 room, doesn't mean he's under the 3 and therefore he's absolved. I just want to make that very clear, that with our allowed uses, it is up to 3 roommates, and a roommate is not a short-term rental.
Right. Okay.
And we probably ought to tighten that up. so that there isn't any ambiguity to it.
So we can maybe look at that definition and make sure it's tight enough as we're reviewing short-term rentals, Steen?
Yep, we can do that. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, obviously, this is a work in progress. So I guess at this point, I'm looking for a recommendation, if the committee feels comfortable with that, to send this on to planning, to recommend to the council to send it on to planning for further development with respect to these proposals, further refinement, and when we've got something near a finished product, we'll hash that out at the appropriate time. So I guess I don't want any firm recommendations about 184 days, 180 days, waivers, but to keep in mind what we discussed here and just keep process moving forward.
It would be my hope that we're going to review this again as we move along.
Yes.
Okay. I just don't want to see him make a proposal and come in here and just shoot it down because it doesn't meet one of our or all of our needs.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to get some kind of a final proposal from the planning department that'll be forwarded on to all members of the city council and to this committee. We can then make a decision as to whether we want to have another meeting or not. We can do that if we need to.
Okay, fair.
It's not my idea that we're just going to come in cold with a proposal for the city council, the planning board. I think it's got to go through the planning board first anyway, doesn't it?
The zoning it's a zoning change, it's a
Zoning
zoning ordinance,
change.
so yeah, it needs to go through.
So there'll be a process to that. So with that in mind, do I have a motion to that effect?
I'll make that motion to that effect.
Seconded.
Okay. All those in favor? None. Any other business to come before the board? At 6:43, I adjourn this meeting.